I probably guess the first thing I want to ask is, do you have a favourite play memory that you would like to share?
Yeah, I grew up next to from most of my primary school years, I grew up next to a park. And I think being able to just actually go to a park, and even as a young kid, being able to go on my own was like quite a privilege. Like, but I felt I knew it wasn't universal. And going on Saturday mornings, taking our dog for like a little stroll when I was like 9 or 8. Like, yeah, probably is like what I remember when I think of like play memories.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, playgrounds are a great place for people to go out and experience, especially young children. But not all young children do get to do that. As you recognise, it is a privilege just being able to go out and do that, which is kind of where as an organisation, Play Aotearoa, we advocate for the child's right to play. So do you have an understanding about Article 31 in the United Nations Convention's Rights of the Child?
Yes, my understanding of Article 31 is that it does focus on the sort of well-being elements around play, and I guess that it kind of does go a bit broader as well in terms of like the importance around like cultural spaces and other areas around like being able to participate, and I guess it's kind of like covering a range of issues around recreation, kind of leisure and other elements, and just that recognition that it should be one of those things that people should have universal access to. And it's something, that my understanding is we're signatories to it. Therefore, we have a commitment and responsibility to uphold. Yeah. Well, I can go into more detail if you wanted to.
No, that's great. No,
I guess.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because a lot of people don't actually sometimes understand what Article 31 is, or that we've, as you mentioned, we signed that declaration back in 1993, which kind of lead on to my next question is, where does your party sit in terms of that commitment to Article 31 and the child's right to play?
Yeah, we support it, and I think for us, in terms of what that means in terms of the policy interventions, it means being able to put that lens into many of our policy areas, but from things like eliminating poverty, but also when it comes to urban design, and even things like climate action and transport policy, for example, and so I think making sure that children have access to leisure and recreational spaces and the ability to play is something that we factor in when we're thinking of, for example, what would good climate-friendly or child-friendly housing developments can look like, but also acknowledging that if we're not also ending poverty, we're also creating spaces, households where that access to leisure and play may not be a thing that is universally experienced.
Yeah, no, I see where you're coming from in that, and I think it is something that needs to be factored in. It's that cross-department relationship where play actually impacts so many other areas. It's not just, just not that children's portfolio. It is impacting on what we do in terms of the economy and housing, and that's why we need something for it to go across all areas, so people are considering how this might impact children later on and their right to play in outdoor spaces. Which probably brings me on then to having a chat about, how would your party go about ensuring that there is fair budget provisions in place for play to happen and to naturally occur? Right now it sits within the under a sporting portfolio. So I'm quite keen your thoughts about, should it be under a sport portfolio? Should it be on its own? And how would your party distribute budget so that, it's fair for sport, recreation and play, which is still considered a bit of a new player to the game?
Yeah, great question. I think there probably are multiple interventions we can make, right? One of the things was perhaps it sits both with the formally the Children's Commissioner could have a role in overseeing kind of how the sports and recreation portfolio also takes into account the needs of children. I think there's other factors that we could do in terms of central government devolving funds to local government for meeting those that convention basically. So I think there are multiple ways that we could further ring fence budgets basically to ensure that there's money specifically going towards that. And I think and some of the other questions you do raise a really good point around the sports and recreation portfolio kind of taking a very often high-performance sports lens and then play, and even, to be honest, community sports, which in my view can contribute to that ability to have access to leisure and recreation are, as you mentioned, the younger siblings. And that's something I have been often, more on the kind of community end and community initiatives I have been racing in select committees in that regard. So I think also having MPs taking that lens of scrutiny in select committees and other spaces can contribute towards focusing agencies on the notion of play, not just kind of high performance sports.
And you've just mentioned that, you've been advocating for that back in the select committees. What's the feedback been back to you from the select committees?
I think there's still a lot of work we need to do to genuinely take a community and child-centered lens into how we view sports and recreation specifically in Parliament. I do still think that too much emphasis is given on high-performance sports, which, yeah, sure, it's important, it's where the visibility is, but actually sports and recreation isn't just about creating high-performance athletes, but actually also creating spaces for children in our communities to thrive. And I think, yeah, there's still some tensions there to resolve. But yeah, for me, like as somebody who took on the sports and recreation portfolio for the Greens, and as somebody who asked for it, I think it was because of that. Those other components of the recreation side of things that I think I was more interested in.
No, I appreciate the honesty.
Yeah.
No, that's good. And I guess circling back to those portfolio questions, do you think there's, where does your party sit in terms of, play potentially having its own portfolio, its own minister of play, so to speak?
Good question. I mean, I guess we're not opposed to that in principle. I think there's also the consideration as to whether the sports and recreation portfolio could depend sports, play and recreation. So it's about like whether we broaden the mandate of what is already there or create its own specific position, right? I think we would be open to having a conversation about either, and it would be a matter of I guess whether it's a position that coordinates multiple or works across different agencies as well, because I think access to play would be something that you would want to take a cross-agency approach. I guess similarly to, for example, my co-leader, Madame Davidson, has a role that with the family violence space that requires her to work across different agencies, and that's something that we would want to consider how we would make that work, I guess, if we were to establish a more focused role of broaden the sports and recreation portfolio to more explicitly include play.
Absolutely. And I think, anything where we can incorporate more play and the opportunities for players is something that we're quite happy to champion for as well. I think that's a really important position to have, especially that inclusion piece of being open to having open ideas and open position to work with others. Now, obviously we know there is a national strategy developed by Sport New Zealand, but we don't have a national policy for play. Where does your party's position on developing and adopting a national policy for play?
I think it would be great for government to have a national policy on play and even potentially national policy statements around play, because I think often on areas that involve multiple agencies, and I'll give my example of another portfolio I hold where we don't have a national policy on it, and that's become really problematic. On spaces like immigration and other portfolios, we don't have those national policy statements, and I've seen the impact, having held a portfolio term, of what that means in terms of government making ad hoc decisions and without specific direction. And so we would absolutely support government having national policy on this, and potentially governments, putting out national policy statements so that other agencies, because as we mentioned, fulfilling our commitments to ensuring children have access to play, would require several agencies actually taking that into account. It wouldn't just be one agency who then would solely be responsible. So yeah, a national policy statement or national policy would help guide other groups.
Yeah, agree. That cross-sector agencies working together is really important, and we've seen that in overseas examples. An example of the Welsh government in Scotland, where you've got to have those departments coming together in order to make that national policy work. In terms of Aotearoa, who would you see as the agencies that you would work with as a party to develop that national policy?
I think there's another question you have put around, for example, councils would be one. And I would really agree that, at a local government level, that would be something central government would need to work with. I think it's working at a community level as well, understanding the different community organizations that can help enable that too. But I think that because of the way that, the type of infrastructure that local government looks after, means that central government should be working with local government, I think, first and foremost, to enable infrastructure that enables those rights. But then I think there's also social providers and that government has contracts to that we can also partner up with to enable play to be at the center of that. So, for example, if we're thinking of government contracts that we may have with transitional housing providers, ensuring that we're working with those transitional housing providers to see how we can resource them so that the right to play is actually upheld as part of the services that they provide.
Yeah, you've touched on a really good point there about local councils and helping them into, working with them for that national policy. But what, taking that a step further, if a national policy came into effect, how would you support local councils into upholding and implementing that national policy? Because we all know from local councils, they'll say, this has come from central government, now we have to do it. We don't have the funds, the resources. How would your party support local government in implementing a national play policy?
Yeah, so the Greens have always stood for local governments to entities to be better resourced. New Zealand has one of the lowest proportions of, I guess the way we can, lowest proportion of sort of how much resource central government provides to their local government counterparts. And in order to make these strategies workable, it means central government would have to channel more resources to local government and find other revenue streams so that we can ring fence funding for some of those initiatives. And I think a lot of it is about resourcing, because you did make a good point around having ambitious strategies and then having cash-strapped councils being then made to enable them without the resources out there. And yeah, that's something we would want to look into, about how we can channel more resourcing into local government to enable that.
No, thank you for that. And I think one of the other things is that, we've seen there's a lot of academic and scientific research about the benefits of play for our tamariki and rangatahi, and it's overwhelming. It's crucial for the voice of play to be heard. And obviously, Play Aotearoa, we want to see more play opportunities happening across the country. So we've got great initiatives like Play Streets, local play festivals, the National Play Week. What is your party's plan to provide more play opportunities for children across Aotearoa?
So I guess it sits in many of our policy initiatives we're taking, for example, for this election, right? So one of them is around the removing the toxic stress that households experience, and therefore the children experience by eliminating poverty for families, and then kind of enabling families to be able to ensure that children are able to participate in play. A lot of it is also about how we plan our cities and towns, and ensuring that that play infrastructure is actually built into how we're designing our towns and cities. And I think by being able to do density well and to do transport well, we're able to have more walking and play infrastructure being put in place. So I think our transport policy does go some way towards that. And I think the feedback I would take from our conversation is about making sure that the language of play is more explicitly embedded into how we speak to our policy, but that would be another component to it. And then the other one is about making sure that we're also building good quality public housing that has play facilities alongside, so that it fits all family sizes, but that it has inbuilt play facilities alongside the public housing developments, for example, which is something government has control over in terms of how we build our public housing, and play infrastructure should be part of how we plan our public housing developments.
Yeah, no, good answer there, and I like that idea of that play infrastructure being embedded into those councils. Having spoken and worked with councils, I know firsthand they don't get play. All right, I know there is Sport New Zealand have been doing some fabulous mahi inputting a lot of advocacy play workers in throughout the councils around the country, but they're just one person trying to impact a really huge place like Auckland Council. That's a beast, and you've got one person in there advocating for play. How do we get councils to understand the importance of play? I can speak to my own local council down here in Otago, sorry Jules, but down in Dunedin, but Mayor Radisich, they don't get play. They don't see it. You talk about play, they automatically think playgrounds, and play is so much more than that. So having a voice like yours and being on the Green Party, what can they do to help raise the profile for play, to help people understand that it's important and it's not just an everyday thing that happens? It's so much more than that.
Yeah, and I take your point about it being intentional rather than just a thing that organically just crops up. But I think, I think there's part of this conversation is the feedback that I think political parties, ourselves included, can do more to explicitly talk about the importance of play. I think there's also more I think Sport New Zealand could be better resourced to have more people who can focus. So while I take your point that Sport New Zealand is doing, taking some efforts to some advocacy there, it's about the proportional resourcing that goes into that, and how whether they're actually able to scale that up. Because I do think having that greater advocacy and visibility is what will change hearts and minds. But I also acknowledge it's like with many rights-based issues, it's sometimes something that requires having advocates at different levels, including MPs who can specifically talk to the importance of play. And it's something that this conversation is sparking in terms of making sure we do better to also specifically talk about play in terms of our urban design policies, and like you say, not just playground, but talking about play in the context of inequality as well, for example.
No, absolutely. And I guess, that kind of, looking at those urban design policies and, making play-friendly places or play-friendly cities, what's your take on, for us at Play Aotearoa, we would love every city to be a play-friendly or child-friendly city, but we know things take time and need to be phased in for change to happen. What's your party's position on major cities becoming play-friendly, child-friendly cities?
So I think one example of advocacy that happened in my electorate of Mount Albert was the Inner West Project, where we had a huge number of school-aged children who were advocating for that project to go ahead, because one of the key things that it would have provided was better lacking infrastructure, and therefore, and it was one of the feedback that was communicated was around, well, it may have not been explicitly in relationship to the the language that we're using right now, but it was explicit. Some of the feedback towards council central government was around that ability to have spaces to play, and not and that it wasn't just about the playgrounds, it was about people's commute and just spaces between school and home being spaces of recreation. And how currently, because cities are so car-centric, actually it's really hard for kids to even go out to the streets and play because it's just simply not safe. And that's one element of that. But the other one around public housing developments, that it's about taking a more coordinated approach on how we build housing development so that play is factored into that. And like I said, it's not just about the playgrounds, but it is actually about making sure that we are connecting families and to organizations, that there's, for example, like in Grace Avenue in town, that they have not just commercial spaces, but that they have play spaces built into new apartments. And that's something that I've been advocating for in my social housing space, for example, and whether it's the Inner West project, but also in Grace public housing projects, that it's not just about having the commercial spaces, but play spaces as well.
No, I think you've just hit on something really important there. And you're talking about, the walk-in groups infrastructure and taking back the feedback from those children coming in is about the voice of the child. I think sometimes as adults, we want to do the best for the children, and we want to create these policies, and we want to create change that gives them more benefits. But sometimes we aren't always including them in that process. And for us here at Play Aotearoa, the voice of the child is very important. So if you were going to be moving forward and creating more play spaces, play-friendly cities, a national play policy, how would the Greens go about including the voice of the children in that process?
Yeah, I think it's about having intentional policy around ensuring that voice comes through. I mean, we do have children actually already advocating for, you're right, that the feedback doesn't always come all the way to the halls of power. I guess the Inner West project was a great example where children were actually sending really direct feedback to central and local government. But I think it's about having that feedback loop being entrenched. And I think it's whether we resource and empower the Children's Commissioner to make sure that they can also oversee that voice of children comes through in many spaces, would be another thing we can look into when it comes to the area of play. But I do agree with you that I think what I've noticed being a first-time MP, it's not so much that there isn't a voice of children out there sending us feedback. It's about mechanisms to pick that feedback up and entrench it into decision-making.
Absolutely. I think that's probably key. There is, that youth voice is out there, but it's not always getting through to the right channels. And I guess it kind of brings me to this last final, question that I wanted to ask you was, if elected into government in October, we're talking, less than 6 weeks away. It's coming around very quickly, that 14th of October day. Are you and the Greens prepared to work with Play Aotearoa to make a better play future for our tamariki and rangatahi across Aotearoa?
Yes.
That is amazing. And
if
elected
in... a lot of things is about building our relationship from this meeting, right? Acknowledging that it's about an ongoing relationship and not just a straight up yes and then that's it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, we are ones to keep to our word, and we will hold you to that if elected in on October 14th, but we'll continue to build the relationship moving forward.